This is our fourth panel in today's event on the National Firearms Act. Our first speaker will be Clayton Cramer. He'll be joining us via Zoom because, well, health reasons necessitated. But we're very happy to have him. Clayton is, he's got a master's degree in history. He teaches at the College of Western Idaho. He's published 9 books covering scholarly histories of weapons. He's got about 20 law review articles on the topic. And he's one of those people that just does this for fun. And I'll just tell you one story about him. I remember some years ago, someone saying that, you know, we need such and such written up so that we can cite it in a brief or something like that. Clayton replies, I'm about to get on an airplane. I'll write something up on the plane and I'll send it out to this group when I've landed. Love it, right? Love it. So here he is. Today he's going to talk to us, excuse me, about some of what we heard snippets of the hearings surrounding the National Firearms Act and its enactment, what people said, and so on. Clayton, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay, and we can hear you fine. Just so everyone knows, we've got 15, each speaker is going to speak for 15 minutes. Ashley's going to give us the hand signs, 5, 2, and 1. Clayton, you probably won't see that, so as you get close, I'll come up and I'll make signs, or I'll somehow let you know that you're getting close. Okay, thanks a lot. Go ahead. Oh, do you have a PowerPoint to share, or should I put it up?
I thought I'd sent that to you.
You did, okay. Let me get it up.
And you'll just need to advance it over to George.
Okay, now let me actually, hang on a second here. The challenges of, hang on, I want it to show up on the other screen somewhere.
Be there, but I had open heart surgery about 5 weeks ago and just barely getting to recover enough to be able to do this even.
Last week. You know what? I'm just trying to. How do I get your PowerPoint to show up?
Hang on, let me see what happens.
Are you able to run it on your end? Ah, fantastic. All right, give it a shot, see if you can advance, and then if you can, there we are, perfect. It's all you,
Okay.
Clayton.
Thank you. Hello, my talk is about the congressional hearings concerning the National Firearms Act of 1934. As late as 1934, how did Congress understand the limitations of the Second Amendment placed on machine gun regulation? In light of Bruin, this adds context for how to interpret the powers of Congress and of the states to regulate National Firearms Act arms. For those reluctant to see Glock switch vending machines in high schools, the news is not all bad. Bruin imposed a historical tradition test on arms regulation. If there were laws in the framing era that regulated arms, or arguably in the period before ratification of the 14th Amendment, and those laws are part of that tradition and are therefore constitutional. There's also an escape clause in Bruin centered around social problems today that have no parallel in those eras. Now, there are no machine guns in the framing era, at least as we would recognize them, and unsurprisingly, there are no laws regulating their possession or use. Civilians did own weapons with potential to commit mass murder on a scale that were capable of achieving similar levels of destruction. Glenn Franklin wrote about the successful efforts of himself and fellow Pennsylvanians in a private non-governmental militia to purchase cannons when the Pennsylvania colonial government simply refused to do so. Ads offering cannon and canister shot appear throughout the framing and early Republic eras. Canister shot, if you're not familiar with it, was a cannon-sized shotgun shell with enormous destructive power. Even one round fired from a modern black powder cannon into a music festival would likely kill dozens. Private parties own cannon, mortars, and hand grenades with sufficient frequency for Boston to prohibit keeping them loaded in your home or outbuildings. Of relevance to modern sporting rifles, there are repeating arms in the framing era, such as the poker gun. Also, the Continental Congress paid a gunsmith named John Belton for developing a repeating musket. After the Revolution, Belton moved to England and continued his development. The East India Company bought at least 500 of these muskets, which were breech loading. There are surviving examples use a detachable magazine. The British National Armory's website describes these as capable of semi-automatic fire. There was a method for basically pulling back the matchlock in each position. So you could just keep holding her. There are repeating arms in private hands from 1468 that were not recoil or gas operated, and therefore not technically machine guns, but they're functionally indistinguishable, I would say. Let me show you an example.
Go.
I think this demonstrates that the difference between this and a machine gun is really a distinction that has no real difference. I mean, these would be quite dangerous weapons, and I'm finally not getting.
Go.
And yes, Gatling guns were privately owned. According to the New York Times, the New York Times is protected from a mob by a privately owned Gatling gun. The irony of the New York Times being protected by a machine gun is just too good not to revel in. After the Civil War, the government disposed of some of them at auction. Here you can see an example of one of these ads offering Gatling guns for sale and the price that they got for selling them. They seem not to only been in government hands. I've managed to find ads offering them for sale at private auctions as well, such as this ad from 1866, I think it is. So if rapid fire repeating arms were not present in the framing era when Congress debated the 14th Amendment, they were certainly in private hands. If the 14th Amendment's extension of the Second Amendment with respect to such weapons concerned anyone that has left no tracks in the record, if anyone was concerned about that when they were debating the 14th Amendment, no one said anything. Now, the National Firearms Act of 1934 was Congress's first law substantially regulating firearms. It targeted criminal use of firearms. This meant both by organized crime associated with prohibition and the less organized but still frightening roving interstate gangs such as Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger. Which arms did the Roosevelt administration want to regulate? All concealable firearms, all concealable automatic weapons. The bill offered to Congress by Attorney General Cummings did not include machine guns, rifle caliber automatic weapons. A member of the subcommittee asked him why. Cummings explained that the only such weapon readily available was the Browning machine gun. It is, quote, not easily transportable. It is a large, cumbersome weapon that would probably not be used by the criminal class. Because the law seemed most concerned about concealable arms, the Browning belt-fed and Browning automatic rifle would have seemed irrelevant. This seems odd. A number of states, such as South Dakota, Wisconsin, passed machine gun laws during this period, and they included only automatic weapons firing pistol shells 30 caliber and larger. So basically, they were aimed at Thompsons. They were not particularly concerned about machine gun, belt-fed machine guns. Watching is what even the bill's proposed considered the constitutional limits of congressional authority. Members of the subcommittee asked Attorney General Cummings, why use this complex tax registration scheme? Why not require owners of automatic arms to register them? Cummings was quite direct that, quote, I'm afraid it would be unconstitutional. Similarly, in response to the question, why not forbid private ownership of a machine gun? His response was, you see, if we made a statute absolute forbidding any human being to have a machine gun, you might say there's some constitutional question involved. Cummings explained this complex combination was barred from the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1906. The goal was to get around the lack of congressional authority to prohibit manufacture of machine guns. Nor do you believe Congress could prohibit possession directly. Some congressmen asked Cummings if the Second Amendment was an obstacle to such laws. It appears that Cummings saw this as not just an absence of delegated authority, but as contrary to the Second Amendment. There were powers delegated to Congress under which Cummings saw authority, the Interstate Commerce Clause and Congress's authority to impose excise taxes. was in this interesting and well-constructed intersection of powers that Cummings saw a way to deal with violent criminals' possession of firearms. This raises an interesting question. What other rights in Amendments 1 through 8 can be taxed in order to exercise that right? Exercise tax on laser printers, on churches, on front doors with respect to search warrants? Opening an interesting avenue to challenge parts of the NFA 34 and its successor, NFA 68, as well as its cousin, the Gun Control Act of 1968. As Cummings admitted, the law was narrowly targeted. A member from Arkansas pointed out the law required you to have a license from your home state when carrying a pistol across state lines. Arkansas, like many other states, had no handgun licensing law. Cummings is very confident that not having a permit would create no hazard. If he wants to get a permit, that would protect him. Not even having one, just wanting one. This suggests that unless you remember one of the interstate criminal gangs, you had nothing to fear from the National Firearms Act of 34. At the Reno gun show some years ago, I met an obvious BATF undercover agent attempting to sell an M3 grease gun that he, quote, found in his father's basement. Now, while I would like an M3, I'm not that stupid. The I'm not a criminal might make an interesting as applied argument under this theory of that Cummings advanced of what the law was targeted at. Until the Hughes Amendment to the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1968, there were no constitutional problems with Cummings' clever and run around the Second Amendment. Even today, you can buy a machine gun in many states. You need a letter from your CLEO or Attorney General declaring that there are no legal impediments to purchase. At one time, maybe even today, CLEOs sometimes needed the nudge of a writ of mandamus to issue such a letter. The buyer then submitted fingerprints for a background check and paid the $200 transfer tax. Transfers of existing pre-1986 machine guns remain lawful, but new manufacturers prohibited, in spite of Cummings' certainty that Congress lacked that authority. As others have mentioned here, the effect of the Hughes Amendment was to send prices of transferable machine guns skyrocketing. The hazard of bad people getting licensed machine guns, which seems to have been rare before 1986, is solved, right? There are doubtless whether the Glock switches that fit into Glock pistols and make them full auto is becoming a problem in some communities among gangs. There was a recent mass shooting in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 and wounded 17. There were gang members using Glock switches. While I am generally skeptical of public safety arguments for gun regulation, I might make an exception for the Glock switch. I fired a full auto 22 pistol, a Trejo made in Mexico. It was a lot of fun and very controllable. A full auto 9mm pistol just screams for regulation because of how imprecise it's going to be and what it hits. I do not see them as controllable enough to be usable for self-defense. This all seemed hard to justify by the insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment. The complex and clever scheme that Cummings created in 1934 seems to meet the requirements of the Second Amendment. Law-abiding citizens were still free to purchase machine guns. Manufacture new machine guns for civilians remained lawful. The law was only going to be used against criminals, right? The Hughes Amendment seems contrary to the Second Amendment. And this actually went by faster than I was expecting.
All right, thank you, Clayton. We'll keep you up there so that you can listen to the other panelists, and then we'll have questions after the others go as well. If you would mute yourself. Oh, I can mute you. Look at that. Fabulous. Okay, our next speaker is Ted Noel. He's a retired board certified anesthesiologist. He's been in medicine for 36 years. He developed an interest in this field through his hobby, which is the enjoyment of firearms and the beauty of engineering displayed by them. I heard somebody make an interesting remark about firearms one day, and he said, after airplanes, they're the engineering implement that has to go the longest time between failures. They have the longest mean time between failures after anything out there except airplanes, which is an interesting comment, and I think makes sense, right? Given the people who rely on them daily and so on. He's going to talk to us today about the physical characteristics of firearms and how the NFA bans firearms or regulates firearms based on those characteristics. Oh, you had a. It's over here, and you had a slide, right?
I have one slide.
One slide.
Just-
That's
Okay.
my contact information.
Well, there you go. Fabulous. The least intrusive slide of the day, ladies and gentlemen.
Right. By the way, I am a doctor. I do not play one on television. And that means I have to put on my other hat. And I'd like to thank the organizers for their gracious grant of an honorable place in this discussion to one who has not risen through the ranks of the academy. I hope to honor their decision by avoiding the performance of the Ninth Circuit Court in Young v. Hawaii, which Nelson Lund described as a naked willingness to substitute a figment of judicial imagination for legal analysis. There are some subjects I will not address. These include place and manner of carry, age of ascension to the right, and whether lugging an artillery piece to the grocery store is protected. We may also avoid the morass of arbitrary restrictions embodied in the NFA and its progeny. Many of those should be intuitively obvious to the casual observer. In Bruin, the Supreme Court reiterated Heller's holding that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense. Also, constitutional rights are enshrined with the scope they were understood to have when people adopted them. Mark W. Smith has explained that in every Bill of Rights decision from the Supreme Court, the pertinent date for interpretation is 1791. Now, the Second Amendment extends prima facie to all instruments that constitute bearable arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding. This key holding in Heller is a rebuttable presumption that shifts the burden of proof to the state to overcome a citizen's assertion that a given weapon is protected. The Supreme Court in Heller, following ancient English history, declared that for a weapon to be banned, it must be both dangerous and unusual. Unfortunately, this led the court directly into a swamp. In Cayetano v. Massachusetts, the stun gun used by defendant Cayetano was similar to those owned by at least 200,000 other law-abiding citizens. By the court's reckoning, that made it common. This turned commonality into an accounting task. It also gave the court an excuse to avoid the dangerous leg of the conjunctive construction, since a common weapon can't be both dangerous and unusual. In Bruin, the court revisited dangerousness. It explored medieval British laws regarding weapons, teasing out reasons for various rules, but it never properly addressed dangerousness, simply assuming that some weapons might be inherently dangerous. Along the way, it glossed the fact that dangerous in the English understanding was a feature of how the weapon was carried, not what was carried. Did the bearer intend to spread fear? Was he disturbing the peace? Now, 18 U.S. Code 930 defines a dangerous weapon as any weapon, device, instrument, material, or substance that is used for or readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. Since any firearm is by definition capable of causing death or serious bodily injury, it is necessarily dangerous under 18 U.S.C. 930. That means that dangerousness is useless as a legal criterion for discriminating between firearms. And since every technological advance in arms was or will be by definition unusual, that term is similarly useless. So at present, there are no judicially cognizable criteria for banning any portable weapons. This is in keeping with the word of Copel and Greenlee, who found no tradition of restrictive criteria on what arms could be carried up to 1900. The Bill of Rights was a response to public fears that the government would curtail pre-existing freedoms. In New York Free Times, the court noted that in response to an overwhelming public clamor, James Madison offered a series of amendments to satisfy citizens that these great liberties would remain safe and beyond the power to abridge. The amendments were offered to curtail and restrict the general powers granted to the government. The Bill of Rights does not tell the citizen where he is allowed to go. It tells the government where it is forbidden to tread. The Heller Court put it this way: a constitutional guarantee subject to future judges' assessments of its usefulness is no constitutional guarantee at all. First and Second Amendments are the only free exercise parts of the Bill of Rights. Now, I'm leaving out the voting rights stuff, which is Reconstruction and beyond. During the debates leading to their adoption, both were presented as rights that were not to be infringed. By 1791, the First Amendment changed the word infringe to abridge. Now, if we look at a Venn diagram between the two words, there's an overlap. Semantic range of words does that. But abridge primarily means to reduce in scope, and infringe means to violate, and that definition hasn't changed. We should understand the change in language as used by ex parte Bain. It is never to be forgotten that in the construction of the language of the Constitution here relied on, as indeed in all other instances where construction becomes necessary, we are to place ourselves as nearly as possible in the condition of the men who framed that instrument. They therefore must be understood to have used the language which they did in the full sense of its necessity and value. Now, the implications of abridged versus infringed are important. Certain forms of speech, such as incitement and slander, have long been understood to be outside the proper bounds of free speech. A denial of abridgment simply means that you can't constrict the area that's protected any farther. Now, while Supreme Court jurisprudence here is not as clear and consistent as we might like, limits on First Amendment rights generally require a degree of heightened scrutiny. And you have to have some sort of compelling government interest, narrowly tailored remedies, and even-handed application. The universe of bearable weapons is not bounded in the same manner as speech. Rather, that universe is continually expanding, while a key purpose for the protected weapons remains as stated in Heller, personal defense. The right to keep and bear those arms is inviolable and stated in an unqualified manner, implying that whatever scrutiny applies in the First Amendment context, it becomes the minimum protection in the Second. The NFA and its progeny clearly infringe on Second Amendment rights, but understanding the way they do it comes from First Amendment prior restraint law. Once again, we find ourselves in early Industrial Revolution England. As printing presses became available, some were used to print material contrary to the king's interests. Licensing of presses was instituted, allowing favored individuals to exercise the privilege of printing. Should licensees later displease the sovereign, the license could be revoked. Thus, the license was a prior restraint on what could be printed. New York Times versus US gives us a condensed version of the issue. Any system of prior restraint on expressions comes to this court bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. The government thus carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the imposition of such a restraint. The NFA and its progeny are a pervasive system that licenses a constitutional right, converting it into a privilege. It is a comprehensive prior restraint scheme, and it came into being as a way to get around the Second Amendment. And I'll just quote Homer Cummings, one point, says, when you say we will tax the machine gun, and when you say the absence of a license, my license on a suppressor, showing payment of the tax has been made indicates that the crime has been perpetrated. You're easily within the law. He said the quiet part out loud. He wanted to license guns, and if he could license them, he'd have the power to revoke those licenses. And here we must turn to NFIB versus Sebelius. That's the Obamacare case, where Chief Justice Roberts determined that, quote, a label cannot control whether the Obamacare penalty is or is not a tax for the purposes of the Constitution. That $200 tax for this guy, and no, this is just a prop. is actually a license fee. You must pay it before you can exercise the privilege of holding and using your suppressor, short-barreled rifle, or other NFA item. You must have it in your possession when you take the item to the range for use. If you wish to transport your SBR to another state, you get prior ATF approval. And guess what? I can't sell my suppressor to anybody. You can't do it. Why? They have to get a license from the ATF. I have had a license to hold it, and I never get my license fee back. They have to get the license, and they become the licensee. I don't own that suppressor. I have a license to hold it. Moving back up the supply chain, Ezel v. Chicago held that for the Second Amendment to have meaning, there had to be places to practice. By implication, this also requires guns to shoot and ammunition to put in them. That means that manufacturers, wholesalers, and retail stores must exist before you can exercise your right. Yet GCA 68 now licenses every step in the chain of commerce for guns, unlike any other industry. And I'm just going to gloss over this very quickly, but they pay a license fee. They have to inscribe a serial number. They have to send that serial number to the ATF and so on. There's a whole bunch of hoops they have to jump through. And the question is this a material restraint? In Harper v. Board of Elections, the court held that a $1.50 poll tax violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Today, that'd be $9.37. If we start with that annual $1,000 FFL cost and add engraving of serial numbers, mandated record keeping, and so on, which has to be shared with the feds, it's easy where this gets to be $10 per gun. That's on every gun. It has become an impermissible prior restraint on the right to keep and bear arms at every step in the chain of commerce. I bumped the mouse. Okay. And so doesn't matter what the physical characteristics of the gun are. It's restrained by the ATF and the National Firearms Act and all of its 10 amendments that have come along through time. NFA and its progeny began with Cummings and a desire to turn a constitutional right into a privilege by using a camouflaged licensing scheme. Perhaps the best way to illuminate the unconstitutionality of the NFA is to listen to some First Amendment decisions stated in Second Amendment voice. From Neer v. Minnesota, the fact that for approximately 150 years there's been an almost entire absence of attempts to impose previous restraints upon the right to keep and bear arms is significant of the deep-seated conviction that such restraints would violate a constitutional right. New York Times versus U.S. 1971, any system of prior restraints on firearms ownership comes to this court bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. U.S. v. Stevens, the same thing. And then finally, NRA v. Vullo out of Massachusetts. The Second Amendment prohibits government officials from relying on the threat of invoking legal sanctions and other means of coercion to achieve the suppression of disfavored arms. Those were all First Amendment cases. I just recast them in Second Amendment voice. I'm good.
Great.
We're done.
Let's see here.
And Tom has a
Excellent. We'll start with getting the monitor turned on. That should be the easiest part of our day, but clearly, oh, there we are. Okay. I think we're okay. There we go. Excellent. Why isn't it showing up here? Well, whatever.
You have to share the screen.
Bad juju.
Did we get unplugged here?
I thought I want something here.
Okay.
If you click on the Zoom icon, George, on the bottom, it should just pop up.
There we are. It was just a,
You have to share it with the Zoom.
I will. All is good.
His mother taught him to share.
Put that down. Okay, our next speaker is Tom Bell. He holds a JD from the University of Chicago School of Law. He practiced law in Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C. He spent some time at the Cato Institute before he joined the faculty at the Chapman University Fowler School of Law. He teaches constitutional law and all of the first-year common law courses. And he'll be talking to us today about the counter militia Second Amendment. Thank you. You want to advance here with the arrows? There you go. Either one. You also have a clicker. In theory, you have a clicker. There we go. Now in reality. Good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. Thanks for sparing some of your time to hear this theory of the Second Amendment, which I dare say you will find novel. You might find it incorrect, but I do think you'll find it new. And some of you might find it appealing. It's basically an argument that whereas most people view the Second Amendment as being pro-militia, in fact, it is designed to counteract militias, both well-regulated militias run by the federal government and unregulated militias, such as those run by the KKK and other paramilitary organizations. I'm going to defend this view of the Second Amendment using the text of the Constitution, its structure, the original meaning of the Second Amendment, and consent of those governed. The one thing I cannot cite is precedent. Indeed, if you can find and send to me, please, any evidence that anyone else has thought of this, please do, because I'm at a loss. I have found one source from which I drew inspiration, and I'm still looking for others. It's remarkable to me that so few people have seen this. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe they're wrong. Let's find out. At the end of this, you'll discover quite a new and interesting result. And I don't defend this as the most familiar or comfortable interpretation of the Second Amendment. I defend it as the best interpretation of the Second Amendment. So let me begin with a story, a cautionary tale about this guy. You do not want to make the same mistake this guy made, Croesus. And no, I don't mean wearing a beard with eyeliner. That might actually work for you. No, Croesus, he was the king of Lydia way back in ancient Greece, and he wanted to invade Persia. So he went to the oracle at Delphi, and he asked the oracle, should I invade Persia? And here's what the oracle said. If you march against the Persians, you will destroy a great empire. That's what the rest of that says. And Croesus, being of an optimistic bent, took that as a sign that he should go invade Persia. And in fact, what happened was he was defeated by the Persians. He was put on a lit pyre and escaped with his life only because the gods intervened with a timely rain shower. So he made it back to Greece, and he went to the oracle at Delphi, and he says, what was with that? You told me to go invade the Persians. And the oracle at Delphi said, the empire I was referring to was your own. And I believe most people who look at the Second Amendment are making the same mistake. Here's the language. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It seems like everybody except me and Erwin Haas, the fellow from whom I got this idea, read that as basically pro-militia. The militia is a good thing, so we should have a right to keep and bear arms. And there's two versions of this. This is kind of the generic version of the pro-militia view. This is basically the view of Heller and its progeny. Heller and its progeny actually they're in an awkward position, actually. I could get into the details, I won't, I don't have time, but basically it's a little awkward, this view, but Scalia, being a genius jurisprudent, managed to square the circle. And he said basically, oh yes, the right to keep and bear arms does help the general militia, is what Scalia claimed. I'm afraid he did not have a good argument there, which I detail in my paper, which is available on SSRN, by the way. Thank you, law review friends. You let me put the draft on SSRN. And then Scalia put in this kind of parenthetical, but it's also for personal self-defense. Well, that is a way to read it, to be sure. And I'm sure advocates of, this is not working out, advocates of the right to keep and bear arms do like that. But let's go back to this kind of generic pro-militia view. This is the prevailing, I got it, it's working now. So I had to hit the button a little harder. Okay.
Since I'm here.
In order to promote the effectiveness of the militia. Well, I don't think so. And let me give you an analogy. Consider, here's what I'm going to present. This is the counter-militia view of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, but also being a threat to liberty. It's basically an apology. sorry, guys, but we have to have not a standing army. We're not going to do that to you. This is the way the conversation went during the founding era. But no standing army. Of course, we wouldn't do that. That'd be a terrible threat to liberty. But we do need to have a militia. Sorry about that. I know you're worried about tyranny just like we are, but don't worry. You have the right to keep and bear arms. So that's basically where I end up with the counter militia view of the Second Amendment. And look at this analogy. This is the way the Second Amendment is structured. Imagine you get an invitation to a party. Sunny skies being forecast, attendees should dress accordingly. Now, if you got an invitation to go to a party, an outdoor party in Phoenix, Arizona, you would think, well, I better wear sunscreen or broad-brimmed hat, long sleeves. If you're going to a party in Birmingham, England, you're going to say, great, I can bare my shoulders and get a tan. The structure doesn't tell you what to do. It just says, here's a fact, here's a consequence. And so we start with, okay, well-regulated militia may be necessary to the security of a free state. That doesn't tell us good or bad. Whether that's good or bad, my argument is it's a necessary evil. That's why you end up with the counter-militia view of the Second Amendment. So let me get into some of the arguments for this. You've already seen from the text, it's totally consistent with the text. There's no reason to think this isn't the proper meaning. It's not contradictory to the meaning. So that's fine, it suits the text. There's actually two versions of this. There's two kinds, two flavors of this. I think the founders were actually worried about what they called a select militia. A select militia is what we have now with the National Guard. This is a select coterie of people who go and train to help out the army or the state that they live in a time of need. And the founders were very worried about select militias. They worried they would be transformed into basically standing armies. And indeed, that's basically what the National Guard is today. They weren't wrong about that. The other thing we have to worry about are militias that are, let me go back, militias that are, let's see it in this slide here, militias that are badly regulated. So we worry both about too much government, that's the well-regulated militia that serves the ends of the national government, and too little government, when the government does not come around to protect us from these thugs, which cropped up all over the South after the Civil War, who come around to violate civil liberties. So militias at both extreme are bad, and the check and balance, to use a constitutional term, against those excesses or deficiencies of government is the right to keep and bear arms. So why would you adopt this? I've already said the plain meaning of the text, it works. And the plain meaning should be our lodestar. That's what we start with, and oftentimes we stop with. We start with the plain meaning of the text, we read it, makes sense, we're good. I could give you some quotes from the Supreme Court on that. I'm going to save my quotes to when we get to originalism. Let's talk a little bit about constitutional structure first, though. The pro-militia argument actually imposes on the Constitution some really weird structural features. For example, it's the only place, if you take the pro-militia view of the Second Amendment, it's the only place in the Bill of Rights where you're actually affirming a government power. Yay, militias. We're going to help militias. What is that doing in the Bill of Rights? It doesn't belong there. That says to me, that's a kind of a weird reading. That's not the reading the founders had in mind. That's not the reading we should have in mind. Another funny thing about the pro-militia view of the Second Amendment, it basically posits a reason. It gives a government power, and then it gives you a reason for it, right? It says, we want to have this government power to secure a free state, and so people are going to have the right to keep and bear arms. Nowhere else, except in one place, does the Constitution adopt that structure. That one other place is the preamble of the Constitution. We the people, in order to form more perfect union, secure the blessings of liberty, etc., do ordain and establish this Constitution. That's a good place to do that, in the preamble, where you say, here's the things we want to do, here's what we're doing to achieve that end. And then the pro-militia people would say, oh yeah, there's one other place in the Constitution where that happens, and it's in our pro-militia reading of the Second Amendment. Very suspicious to me. I'll move on though. Let's talk about original meaning. So here I want to share some quotes with you. Originalists do like quotes from the original text, and so do I. And I'll tell you that the original ratifiers of the Constitution worried very much about militias. So here is the minority report of the Pennsylvania Committee, a very influential source of original meaning. And here's what they said about the militia. The absolute unqualified command that Congress have over the militia may be made instrumental to the destruction of all liberty, both public and private, whether of a personal, civil, or religious nature. Now, many gun rights advocates seem to have this romantic view of serving in the militia. And I say to them, think twice, think again. Do you really think it would be awesome to be called up into the militia? It would be a gross violation of your civil liberties. And here's what the Pennsylvania, the minority report of the Convention of Pennsylvania said about that. Those who are called up in the militia may be subjected to fines of any amount. They may be subjected to corporal punishments of the most disgraceful and humiliating kind, and to death itself by sentence of a court martial. Think about what it means to be called up in the general militia. Here come some government officials. They say, put down your tools, step away from your shop, leave your family, leave your farm. You're coming with us. Oh, you don't like that? We can court martial you and shoot you if you don't follow our orders. Now come along. We're going to go to another part of the country and oppress some of your fellow citizens. And if you don't like that, again, we got court martial in store for you. Being called up to the general militia was no picnic. You might well want to have some firearms in the back room if that starts happening, to protect yourself and your fellow citizens. Think about that. Also, we have to worry what the militia will do to citizens, of course. And we saw this in the Whiskey Rebellion. I won't get into the history of that. It's quite interesting. It's about the only time the general militia was called up and put to use, and that was to suppress a tax rebellion. So the general militia is a threat both to the people who are called up and to those that the militia is used against. That's why we have the right to keep and bear arms. I could go more into the original meaning. I will just say this, that those of you who love Heller have a problem with original meaning, which the Heller opinion glossed over. And it appears in Federalist Paper 29, where Alexander Hamilton basically tells us the kind of militia we're talking about in the Second Amendment, that is a select militia. Hamilton in that Federalist Paper even uses the phrase well-regulated militia. And I wish I could get into the details, see the paper, but that is problematic. I'm going to move on. I have only a few minutes to spend with you. Consent to the people. I'll go quickly through this as well. Basically, the principle of contra proferentum, that's a contract law principle that says you interpret against the drafter of a legal document any ambiguities. Now, we've looked at the Second Amendment, and you see now that, wow, you can read it one of two ways. When that happens, you should read it in favor of the person on whom the provision is impressed. We did not write the Second Amendment. So all ambiguities in its interpretation should go the way of we the people, which means what? The strongest protections of the right to keep and bear arms possible. I move on. Not precedent, though. I got the idea from this from a little tiny, like 4 or 5 paragraph entry by a doctor, Ted. Erwin Haas, I've tried to track him down. This was 14 years ago. He was then already a man in retirement. He might have passed away. And he basically introduced me to this idea that the Second Amendment is actually designed to protect against the militias. And nothing else. Nothing else. It's hard to prove a negative. The people in law review are saying, can you tell us, can you prove nobody else has talked about this? And I've used AIs, I've run my Westlaw searches, I've talked to my colleagues who do Second Amendment law. If you can help me, send me a note. I would love to flesh it out. So far, it's me, Haas, if he's still around, and everybody else. So what does this mean? Well, basically, it means that you've all been seeing the vase, and I want you to see the faces. Everybody else has been saying it's to protect, it's to support, it's pro-militia, and I say you got it all backwards. The Second Amendment is designed as a counterbalance to militias, and that's the way to really give it teeth. Now, what does this mean for the NFA? What does it mean for a lot of federal regulation? I don't have all the answers there. I'm a theorist. I put this out there and say, here's the way to read it. How you apply it, I think we need to let courts and scholars and commentators, people like you, figure that out. I will say, though, you'll like this, Ted. I'm sure a lot of you will like this. It probably will lead to a very robust right to keep and bear arms. Why? Because you have to have a right to keep and bear arms, which will be effective to prevent militias from messing with your liberties. Sawed-off shotguns? I don't know. Talk to somebody who does military tactics. It may turn out that sawed-off shotguns are pretty useful in close combat with militia forces. Machine guns? Oh, I think you definitely have a case there. Go down the list. I don't have all the answers, but I will say the question you should ask is, will this help free people defend themselves against the abuses of militias? Now, I know that a lot of you will find this shocking. Many readers will. And I say to you, look, I'm not saying this is the most comfortable, the most comforting, the most familiar interpretation of the Second Amendment. It was written by the founders. They weren't like us. The average age of the founders was 44 years old when they signed the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, they wore silk stockings and they wore wigs, but they were successful revolutionaries who had brought down the most powerful military force on earth. Those are the kind of people who would write a Second Amendment that says, we want to be well armed in case government goes too far or drops the ball and doesn't do its job. Now, I'm not sure Americans today want that. All I say is, that's the Second Amendment you got, people. You don't like it, there's a way to amend the Constitution. In the meantime, get cracking and make it mean what it means. Thank you. You don't know.
Okay, great. So our next and last speaker on the panel before we get to Q&A is Chris Land. Chris is the general counsel in our very own Senator Cynthia Lummis's office. Unfortunately, that took him from Wyoming and brought him to DC, but we were able to bring him back for this. When he's not talking about the NFA and museums and things like this, and laws about NFA arms in museums, he's doing digital assets and cryptocurrency and all that kind of thing, or at least that's one of his specialties. Now, as Senator Lummis's general counsel, he's got to do everything, right? As all good lawyers should do. So today, he'll be talking to us about a bill proposed by Senator Lummis's office that would allow museums, and I'm paraphrasing here, and he'll give you the details, to acquire and display NFA items that are things like war trophies and that otherwise would be lost to history, and that are being lost to history because the NFA regulates them. And he would like to say, he and his senator, our senator, would like to save part of history. And so he'll talk a little bit about that. Let me share the screen here for you.
It's already shared.
Oh, fabulous.
Thanks, George. So let me pull this up real quick. There we go.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Land. I'm General Counsel to U.S. Senator Cynthia Lummis. I do Second Amendment stuff, but as George mentioned, mostly digital asset law. Most of my interest in the Second Amendment and what I do for Senator Lummis is based on my own personal experience with firearms. I've kind of developed my own small firearms collection throughout the last decade or so. So I'm going to kind of start. It's step one, how Senator Lummis developed the idea for this bill and kind of take you on to what one lobbyist in DC lovingly referred to as the quote nerd gun bill. So many Second Amendment bills in DC are mostly political tools to bash the other side. And Senator Lummis views this piece of legislation as getting to work, making changes that actually benefit Americans and preserve our firearms heritage. So let's start back in the 1950s. This is where my own side of the story started. I wasn't born in 1950, but in the 1950s, the US government had a lot of M1 Garands lying around, a lot of M1 carbines lying around. And what was happening in the 1950s? Communists were, taking over countries. North Korea, was in the middle of a war. The Comintern was, they were trying to spread communism throughout the world. So the US had this great idea. We're going to take some of these surplus guns that we had lying over from World War II, and we're going to give them away to countries like Greece and the Philippines that had a communist insurgency problem. Help them, defend their own borders from communist insurgents. Those guns, like the M1, were in those countries, and many of them still are in those countries today. They're pieces of US history literal tangible pieces of US military history that have been used by countries to defend themselves. And now those countries, the M1 Garand isn't a particularly useful, weapon, to fight insurgents today, although they are still being picked up on battlefields in Afghanistan, and every now and then they'll find a person in the jungles of the Philippines that has an M1 Garand. But they're not particularly useful today. So what better place than to bring those weapons back here so that they can be displayed in museums and so they can be put in the hands of law-abiding Americans to own a literal piece of US history that, that many veterans want to own the M1 that they carried around Korea, just for sentimental reasons. But it's too difficult to do that today. So that's kind of the policy setting for the Lawful Purpose and Historical Firearms Act. My own personal experience with this bill came in 2020 when I was looking to buy an M1 Garand, and I did some research into, how, the provenance of the weapons and, how to get one, et cetera. And I found out that there had been some controversies in the early 2010s during the Obama administration with the State Department blocking the import of certain M1 Garands. And then in 2018, President Trump kind of went the other way and allowed 80,000 M1s to be imported from the Philippines where they were no longer necessary. I happen to own one today, own one of those guns that was imported in 2018. But from Senator Lummis's perspective, the right to own a piece of American history shouldn't depend on, who's, in control at the ATF or the State Department. There should be a uniform policy about when you can own a historical firearm versus when you can't. So this led to Senator Lummis in a great moment of serendipity. In 2015, while I was still in law school, Senator Lummis introduced the Collectible Firearms Protection Act in the House. And this addressed the whole M1 Garand importation issue from, South Korea and the Philippines. And then when she hired me to come to work for her in the Senate in 2020, when she was elected, I had this idea that we wanted to do something about M1 Garands. And then I did some research and figured out that Senator Lummis had actually, in a moment of genius, had introduced this bill in 2015. So we took that 2015 bill and built kind of the nerd gun bill around that 2015 piece of legislation. So I'm just going to walk through the legislation real quick, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions too. But Section 2 of Senator Lummis's legislation would amend the Arms Control Export Act that would permit historical firearms to be imported from South Korea. There's tens of thousands of M1 carbines still in South Korea today that could be brought back home to the US under M1 Garands in other countries too. But this would prevent the State Department, and it's the State Department here that has discretion and not the ATF. It would restrict the State Department from blocking the importation of American weapons that are lawfully possessed overseas. This is another really interesting piece of this bill, Section 3. As George mentioned, the 1986 the Hughes Amendment to the Gun Control Act in 1986, basically makes it impossible, to possess a machine gun in many cases. So, Senator Lummis, we created this section to exempt bona fide museums from the National Firearms Act. They don't have to pay the transfer tax. They can lawfully possess a machine gun post 1986, but it only applies to museums. It's meant to permit museums to, display the full range of weaponry that, would have historical value, including, weapons from the war in Afghanistan, the Iraqi war, more modern type weapons without having to comply with, all the rigmarole of the National Firearms Act. So there are a couple requirements. It has to be appropriately secured, and it has to be displayed to the public, preserved as a historical artifact or used for research purposes. Museum has reasonable discretion on how to secure the firearm. The ATF can't require that it be deactivated or mutilated or anything like that. Kind of it restricts their discretion. The definition of museum is just a definition of a museum that's contained in the tax code today. So it's pretty broad. This would permit the museum to hold on to the machine gun and not violate Gun Control Act. Another provision of this bill is designed to focus well, I should rewind and say that the title of the legislation is called the Lawful Purpose and Historical Firearms Act. There are a lot of provisions throughout our gun laws that require you to have a sporting purpose, to possess certain types of ammunition or to possess certain types of weapons. And this bill would also remove the term sporting purpose from the firearms laws and insert all lawful purposes. So anything you can do lawfully, you should be able to do lawfully with, you know, all kinds of ammunition that are legal. There's a provision that restricts you from loaning a firearm across state lines for anything. You have to have a sporting purpose to loan a firearm across state lines, and you know that doesn't really make sense anymore. Let's see. This is another one of the lawful purpose amendments. There have been some controversies around shotguns, shotgun shells, and large caliber rifles being classified as destructive devices. This is the interstate loans provision. And another thing the bill does is permits the import and export of firearms under the National Firearms Act. It eliminates a lot of the restrictions around import export. It doesn't apply to machine guns because we weren't quite ready. We want to study the machine gun import laws a bit more, but other NFA items that would be able to be exported and imported more easily. So this is the nerd gun bill. We're trying to preserve our firearms heritage, allow museums like the Cody Firearms Museum and, you know, the NRA Museum in Virginia, which is a great museum, by the way, too, to display the full range of weaponry, to preserve our firearms heritage, and to let more Americans own actual historical firearms. So that's all I've got. Thanks, y'all, and look forward to questions.